Hi everyone, it's Alex and this is my July wrap-up. I read 11 books this July, and some of those books that I read I already did reviews for on this channel, so I'll go ahead and mention those books first. One of those books is Story of a New Name by Elena Ferrante, and with this I raved about it, saying that this is my favorite so far that I've read, although this is only book 2 of the Neapolitan novels. The first one is My Brilliant Friend, which is what you all are maybe most familiar with if you haven't dived into this series yet. But this is a great tale of friendship through a span of years, but also thinking about things like what it means to grow as a person, coming of age things, and it just feels very intimate, and I'm really impressed with how Ferrante is able to capture that. Another book I read was Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. I also really enjoyed Gilead. I liked this whole idea, at least for me as a reader, kind of wondering if with John Ames, our narrator who's a priest, and how he's writing these letters to his son, and how whether or not, to me, I feel like John is using that as projection because of course his son not being old enough to reply to these letters yet, assuming John will pass. It's, to me, I felt like John's way of sort of talking to God or sort of verifying his faith as certain people in the town that he lives with sort of conflict his faith. Also, I'll briefly mention, but I've been to like 4 bookstores this month and I've been really good about not buying stuff, but I would go there with the purest intention of feeling it was a stroke of luck that I was in a bookstore and wanting to spend money, and I kept trying to find Home by Marilynne Robinson, which is the second book of this series, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And I know Wilson Shugart and Lukash from Totally Pretentious, they both told me that Home is the best of Robinson's work with this sort of trilogy involving Gilead, Home, and Lila. And I really trust Wilson's and Lukash's insights and opinions, so I'm probably going to end up like ordering Home off of online soon, and I'll hopefully read it in August. Another book I read and did a review for is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. It was made aware to me that I never gave my opinion about this book in my review, but I can really just say that I enjoyed this. I really liked it. However, it didn't really hit me as fast as I would have liked. I felt like the first 100 pages were a bit of a slog, mainly because it's Moshfegh sort of drilling in how our narrator here is so committed to literally being so apathetic with everything involving her life. Like I said though, I think there's definitely a redemption or a reward as you're finishing up this book. I think Moshfegh hits home on a lot of parts of what it means within the themes of this book revolving romance and friendship and other things. So another book I have here that I haven't done a review for technically yet, or at least haven't posted, I did read The Temple of the Golden Pavilion by Yukio Mishima. I actually read this as a part of a buddy read with Matt from MCS Books, and hopefully I think what we're planning to do is a joint buddy read video review type thing. And I had a lot of thoughts about our narrator in this book, but this is about a young boy who, after witnessing a very traumatic event involving his family, that he sort of indulges himself in this quest for primarily what he keeps referring to as beauty. Matt gave me a lot of insights involving a buddy read with this text, and just doing a buddy read in general. I've never done one before, so it was a lot of fun. And if any of you, you know, I guess, like assuming if we mutually subscribe to each other, it's likely that I would love to do a buddy read with you. So yeah, feel free to like reach out to me and let's do a buddy read. So another book I read that seems to be a booktube darling and what also in a way stole my heart is There by Tommy Orange. I've been really skeptical about new release books or hyped books. It seems like I haven't really read one that I can think of lately that's met my expectations, but with this one I can certainly say I really enjoyed this book, and out of the 11 books I read this month, I think I would recommend this one the most. There is really about connected stories involving what Tommy Orange was wanting to do was to give an urban lifestyle portrayal of Native Americans that It's all about finding your roots and sort of how you identify with your culture. And the your I'm describing here is really how natives in this book can sort of identify with how, well, actually, it really involves all of them going to what's referred to as a powwow. And Tommy Orange, he actually, with, a lot of these concepts where you're getting to learn about this culture, Tommy Orange takes the time to give these certain segments where he's enlightening the reader, not only on Native culture, but also how much of our American history here in the States has been hiding a lot of things that we may not know about Native culture until we're much older. And of course, what seems to be the haunting of Native culture, at least what I remembering learning in school, is how Native culture is plagued by suffering, and how much, to me, of what I only know of Native culture is violence and suffering. And I feel like this book does a great job at sort of the ending here. It feels, I feel like to me it was a bit too tying the knot, so to speak, but I understand why Tommy Orange did it. For me, again, thinking of themes like suffering and violence, I think it's to make us sort of have a big discussion about how no matter how much we get to know the characters in here, sometimes things ultimately, by getting to know them, get swept under the rug due to certain situations and circumstances. So another book I read this month that sort of goes along with the hype or sort of, well-reviewed books seems to be Less. As most of you probably know, Less recently won the Pulitzer Prize, and for me, I guess I'll talk about what this is about first. It's about a man named Arthur Less, that's his last name, and he's sort of this failed writer, that's kind of subjective, I think, and it's about him having this sort of tour. So the book is divided into separate parts of where Arthur is traveling. Although to me, when I was reading this, I really liked the narrative structure of this book. We know the whole time that Arthur, he actually isn't our narrator in this book. It's actually this ominous narrator that seems to have connections with Arthur, but we don't know what they really are, and we actually aren't reminded too much of that in the book until there are little sprinkles of it, which I thought was really good. I had almost actually forgot that the whole time that this narrator was someone that we knew was probably a character, but someone that's also involved in Arthur's life personally. And this book, if I could describe it in one word, and it seems to be a word that a lot of people are using, it's that this book is very charming. It's very witty and funny. Arthur's one of the most funny characters I've read in some time, but there are good doses of where Arthur starts to get sort of, for the lack of a better term, serious, and he's sort of reflecting on his whole life, not only on his career, but just his choices, primarily with his love life. For me, however, it seems like this blend of seriousness while also this charmingness, I think it definitely works, although I think Andrew Sean Greer was sort of mood picking whenever he wanted to write certain feelings. So it's like how people, like me, I'm a mood reader. It's like as if I was picking this book up on different occasions depending how I felt. So for me, I felt like that was a way of Andrew sort of making this book in a way too likable, because it is very likable, and I think a lot of people will like this or do like this, and I can see it winning the Pulitzer that way, although this is unique enough to me, at least thinking of, prize culture like the Pulitzer. I think of another past Pulitzer winner, which is actually right up here, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. To me, I thought that book was like fine, but this book up here, too likable to a point where it's sort of, I don't really remember it. It's sort of forgettable in its own way. But with Less, I think it's almost too, it gets almost to the point of All the Light We Cannot See in terms of likability, but it's doing just enough to where Arthur definitely has his own voice as a character and his own presence. And in a weird way, I would love to see this as like a rom-com, if that makes sense. It's not really a comedy, but this also reads like a play to me. Like I would love to see this adapted to a play. I just have so many thoughts clearly about this, but I read this in one sitting too. With this and with There by Tommy Orange, I read them both in one sitting. I was just so enticed by both of them, so I do recommend both. So I actually completely lied because I realized that I actually have a third book that I read in one sitting because I was so gripped by it. And this is actually a nonfiction pick, and that is Autobiography of a Face. This is a memoir by Lucy Greeley, and it really talks about her disfigurement on her face to where a part of her jaw ends up missing. And the way this is presented is pretty chronologically through Lucy's childhood whenever she goes up to her mother, who she constantly refers to being afraid of, and saying that her tooth aches, and then really her mom, and I think even her dad, they just sort of pass it off as like, oh, you're fine, it's just like a toothache or maybe or something. Clearly, though, that isn't the case, as Lucy finds out she has a form of cancer which involves a sort of her jaw deforming and how it's really affected her entire life since. And it's really interesting because whenever I didn't really know what this was about whenever I picked it up, but when I heard cancer, I thought this was going to be sort of a cancer identity memoir, but it actually rebels against that notion where I feel like I'm really tapping into knowing about Lucy as a person instead of her identifying herself so consistently with the cancer. And a part of that, of course, is with Lucy Greeley herself not wanting to be identified with probably what, I mean, for lack of a better term, a cancer memoir. I'm not even sure if that's a real thing, but a lot of Lucy's obstacles are really her alienation that she feels, not only like physically with her jaw, but sort of her distance with her family. And what I love about this memoir is it's sort of that small or brief moments rather that we realize that our parents are actually people. And I feel like Lucy Greeley does a great job of articulating that with her little nuances that she discovers, even to the point of whenever her father ends up dying, that she talks about just talking to her sister in the kitchen, and they were just having a casual conversation, and she realizes that her life is going to be fine even after death, and it's just a very common way of life. And it's the same way, of course, you can imagine with having cancer. Lucy Greeley has been through those thoughts herself about death and dying. This description of sadness, it's so prevalent without being wordy, like it's encapsulated so quietly and with so much feeling that I really loved it. It's really wonderful. I feel like the second half of this memoir, though, towards the end where it talks about Lucy end up going to college, and in fact she ends up becoming friends with Ann Patchett, so reading that, I thought that was great. Very interesting, and Ann Patchett actually does the afterword for this, and you guys know how much I love talking about ethics and the ethics of literature and maybe what's true and not true. And Ann Patchett actually kind of illuminates on this with maybe what's considered true and how what is true versus what feels true as an experience reading this, and how and what that means to Lucy Greeley and what that means in particular to Lucy's family. Another book I have here that's also nonfiction and a memoir is Priestdaddy by Patricia Lockwood. This is a story of Patricia Lockwood admitting that she has to move in back with her mother and father with her, I think either engaged or at this point husband, and they have to move back there just, I think, for like financial reasons. But you can imagine with a name like this that Patricia Lockwood's father, while being in a submarine, decides to convert to Catholicism and he becomes a priest. But he's still, in a way, very immature and inappropriate. And Patricia Lockwood even hints at a lot of moments of abuse towards not only herself, but her siblings from her father. It's strange, because Patricia Lockwood, she says in the beginning of this memoir, she says, "It'll make most sense if I start from the beginning." But it turns out throughout the rest of this memoir that a lot of this feels disrupted, because it really feels more like a collection of essays to me than sort of a memoir with continuity like Autobiography of a Face was. And I feel like Patricia Lockwood knows that. I feel like she, in a way, almost feels uncomfortable getting, emotional isn't the right word, but she deflects a lot, for I think, with humor. She's really funny. Like, she knows how to describe really funny deadpan moments with her family. And that being said, though, it makes it hard to really pay attention to, okay, what are you wanting me to learn most about your family through this text? In particular, a part of this memoir, there's a little parts about where Patricia Lockwood is talking about craft and the craft of writing. Then there's other parts where she's beautifully describing what it's like to be in church and singing hymns and having one of those wax candles in your hand. And I just don't know which Patricia Lockwood I'm supposed to be relating to necessarily. I still recommend this. It just, I didn't read it like how I thought it would be read, but I still enjoyed it. Another book I read this July is The Hours by Michael Cunningham. The Hours is a story that's very much inspired by Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And for me, I gave this 5 stars. One of my favorite reads for sure this July. I actually just had a really good reading month, but to me, I feel like what Michael Cunningham does, other than like sort of reinterpret or reimagine or at least extend the themes and even kind of the plot of Mrs. Dalloway, he also includes this other segment that involves a reader character. So there's a character by the name of Mrs. Brown in this book, and she's actually busy reading Mrs. Dalloway, like the real one by Virginia Woolf. And her whole character serves as a purpose of being a literal manifestation of a person demonstrating their response to reading Mrs. Dalloway. As much of that would be led to the imaginary, since of course Mrs. Dalloway is a real text and it's not like we get to know everyone's response to that. But at least for me, I feel like in some ways Mrs. Brown's response to reading Mrs. Dalloway was the same way for me, about this weird, it's like, you know, the curtains have been drawn back and life looks different ever since, because a lot of what Virginia Woolf is writing about in Mrs. Dalloway is about for me at least, what it means to find purpose and meaning in life, essentially, like the best way I could wrap that up. But it's really interesting with The Hours because we also have a character that's Virginia Woolf herself. And in Virginia Woolf's parts, her parts serve more as sort of context for her as a person, I assume to the best of Michael Cunningham's knowledge, but it's really Woolf writing about Mrs. Dalloway, or in the process of writing it, and what's inspiring her life back then to write Mrs. Dalloway. And we're also, the opening of this book is referring much to Virginia Woolf's suicide. And then finally, the third part that we have in this book that's presented to us is a story about a woman named Clarissa. And of course that name Clarissa is a clear referral to Mrs. Dalloway itself, since there was a character, the main character being Clarissa. It's really beautiful how eventually all of these characters, Mrs. Brown, Clarissa, and even Virginia Woolf in here, they all connect in some way that really reflects sort of the beauty of life to me. And I feel like that's the whole point of the initial text, Mrs. Dalloway. So if you couldn't tell, I would highly recommend this. I would read Mrs. Dalloway first, only because it's so rewarding to find all the little clues and references in The Hours. The 10th book I read this month is The White Book by Han Kang, and this was a lot more of an intimate glimpse of Kang's personal life than I had anticipated, mainly being inspired by, it seems, with this recurring discussion or point of how Kang is sort of haunted by her mother's miscarriage. And of course, if the title wasn't a giveaway, the presence of the color white, although really if you even call white a color, but it's sort of even in The Invisible, and there's a part in here I really love it's called To the Stillness, and it's about sort of the space in between, whether it be time or people or a breath or the snow, and just really a lot of other things, and how white is like a transition color. I mean, it's present everywhere and everything, so it makes sense, but this was such a little lovely read. It feels like holding someone's diary, but just written very beautifully. And finally, the last book I have to talk about is The Butcher's Hook. This is the first thing I've read by Janet Ellis, and I'm excited, but also I just have no idea what I could expect to read from her next. The Butcher's Hook takes place in the 1700s, which I thought would be an absolute bore, but this book is the exact opposite of that. This reads like this book would be so popular among everybody, maybe even the YA crowd or something. It's very plot heavy, so it's very readable and it's very fast paced. But this is about a girl named Anne, and I know I've talked a few times on this channel about wonderful first chapters I've read, and this is certainly in that category. In this first chapter, there's a part of Anne's life that changes, that's sort of really, well actually the first and second chapter, she's had like 2 traumatic events happen to her as a child, and those really shape her and really how she sees other people. And from there, it's just sort of Anne's quest for doing technically whatever she wants. And what I mean by that is, it's like, this is like, her moral compass is very skewed. And I know in one of my past videos, I answered a question about what's a book with the most wildest ride. And I don't even remember what the book I said was, but this definitely takes its spot because it's funny. Anne is deadpan in her delivery of everything. Her internal monologue is captivating, but also in a way terrifying or intimidating. But I loved reading this, and I loved Anne's character, and I can't wait to read more of Janet Ellis's work. So those are all the books I read in July. Like I said, soon I'll be doing that buddy review with Matt, and really, I don't know how I read this much, and I really just hope to read more in August too. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.